Imagine you're the most powerful ruler on Earth, commanding armies, controlling oceans, ruling an empire that stretches across 3 continents. Now imagine watching all of it collapse, not in decades, but in a single afternoon. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail as the greatest naval fleet the world had ever seen. 130 ships, 30,000 men, a mission personally blessed by the Pope. And within weeks, it was gone, shattered, swallowed, scattered across the icy waters of the North Atlantic. What happened between that moment of supreme confidence and total catastrophe is one of the most astonishing stories in the history of human ambition. To understand why Spain launched this mission, you have to understand what Spain was in the late 16th century. This was not simply a nation, this was the center of gravity for the entire Western world. King Philip II sat on the throne in Madrid, presiding over an empire that included modern-day Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, vast territories across South America, Central America, parts of Africa, and the Philippines, which were literally named after him. The gold and silver flowing into Spanish ports from the New World was so staggering that European economies were being reshaped just by its existence. Philip wasn't just a king, he was, by any measurable standard, the most powerful individual human being alive. And yet, something was keeping him up at night. Across a narrow channel of gray, churning water sat England, smaller, poorer, and by Spanish standards, deeply irritating. England had broken from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, had no intention of going back. For Philip, this was not merely a political inconvenience, it was, in his mind, a spiritual crisis. England was a Protestant nation, which meant England was, in the eyes of 16th-century Catholic Europe, a land in open rebellion against God himself. Philip had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister, Queen Mary I, and had briefly sat as co-ruler of England. He knew the country. He understood its ports, its politics, its vulnerabilities, and he believed, with the certainty of a man who prayed for hours every single day, that he was destined to bring England back into the Catholic fold. There was also the matter of Francis Drake. If Philip II was the most powerful man in the world, Francis Drake was the most infuriating. An English sea captain of relatively modest origins, Drake had spent years raiding Spanish ships and ports throughout the Caribbean and the Americas with a kind of cheerful, relentless aggression that made Spanish admirals grind their teeth. In 1577, Drake had sailed all the way around the world, only the second expedition in history to do so, returning to England loaded with Spanish treasure. Queen Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Philip put a price on his head. Then, in 1587, Drake did something that pushed the tension past the breaking point. In a bold, preemptive strike that became known as singeing the King of Spain's beard, Drake sailed directly into the Spanish harbor of Cádiz and destroyed over 30 Spanish naval vessels before they could even be armed. He then swept up the Portuguese coast, raiding supply depots and capturing a massive treasure ship. It was audacious, humiliating, and it delayed the Armada's launch by a full year. But it could not delay it forever. By the spring of 1588, the Armada was ready. The man chosen to command it was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a choice that even at the time raised eyebrows. Medina Sidonia was an aristocrat, an administrator, and, by his own written admission, a man who got seasick easily and had almost no naval combat experience. He actually wrote a letter to Philip begging to be relieved of the command, citing his inexperience and his fragile health. Philip ignored it. In the rigid social hierarchy of 16th-century Spain, rank and bloodline mattered more than expertise. Medina Sidonia was a great noble. Therefore, he would command. The plan itself was sophisticated on paper. The Armada would sail north from Spain, sweep up through the English Channel, and rendezvous with the Duke of Parma, the brilliant Spanish general who commanded a massive army of around 17,000 battle-hardened soldiers stationed in the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium.
Parma's troops would then board flat-bottomed barges, cross the channel under the protection of the Armada's guns, and land on the English coast. Once on shore, the army would march on London. Elizabeth would be deposed, England would be returned to Catholic rule, and the greatest geopolitical problem of Philip II's reign would be solved. It was a plan that required nearly everything to go exactly right. It didn't. The first signs of trouble appeared before the fleet even reached England. Storms battered the Armada as it moved up the Atlantic coast of Portugal and Spain, forcing it to take shelter at the port of Corunna for nearly a month. Ships were damaged. Supplies, already poorly stored, began to spoil. Barrels of water and food that should have lasted the voyage were already rotting or leaking. Morale, which had begun the journey high and righteous, started to fray at the edges. Meanwhile, in England, the mood was something else entirely. Elizabeth I understood the stakes with a clarity that matched Philip's, and she met the crisis with a kind of theatrical courage that her subjects would never forget. On August 8, 1858, the Spanish fleet already in the English Channel, she rode to Tilbury, where her land army was assembled on the banks of the Thames. She wore white velvet and a silver breastplate. She rode on a gray horse, and she delivered a speech that is still remembered 4 centuries later. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was a masterpiece of leadership, raw, personal, and completely devoid of the aristocratic distance that might have kept a lesser ruler safe behind palace walls. But speeches, even magnificent ones, don't sink ships. That job fell to the English Navy.
The English fleet was commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake serving as his vice-admiral. And here England held an advantage that the Spanish had not fully accounted for. English ships, particularly the newer ones, had been designed differently from the Spanish galleons. They were lower, faster, and more maneuverable, built for gunnery rather than for the old Mediterranean style of warfare, which involved ramming enemy ships and boarding them for hand-to-hand combat. The Spanish ships were floating fortresses filled with soldiers, which made sense if you intended to grab enemy railings and fight your way across the deck. But the English had no intention of fighting that way. The English strategy was to stand off at a distance and use their long-range cannons to pound the Spanish formation from beyond boarding range. It was a new kind of naval warfare, and the Spanish, trained for close combat, found it maddening. They couldn't close the distance. The English ships simply moved away. And while the English cannons were causing damage, the Spanish formation, a tight crescent designed to protect its troop transport ships, held together with surprising discipline as it moved up the channel. For days, the two fleets skirmished along the southern coast of England. The Spanish crescent held. But Medina Sidonia was sailing toward a problem he couldn't solve. His plan required linking up with Parma's army in the Netherlands, but Parma's barges, shallow, flat-bottomed vessels designed for river crossings, not open sea, were pinned in port by Dutch rebel warships called flyboats. These small, nimble Dutch vessels had been blockading the Flemish ports, and Parma had no way to break through them without the Armada sailing into shallow coastal waters that the huge Spanish galleons physically could not enter. The rendezvous that the entire operation was built around was, in a very real sense, impossible to execute. Parma knew it. Medina Sidonia was beginning to suspect it. Philip II, back in Madrid, did not yet know it. The Armada anchored off the port of Calais, in French territory, to wait. That was when the English played their most dangerous card. On the night of August 7th, the English sent in the fire ships. 8 vessels were stripped of everything valuable, packed with tar, pitch, gunpowder, and anything else that would burn, and sent drifting downwind toward the anchored Spanish fleet on the tide. In the darkness, the glowing ships looked terrifying, and the Spanish, remembering a type of incendiary weapon called a hell burner that had devastated a river fleet some years earlier, panicked.
Ships cut their anchor cables and scattered in every direction, breaking the formation that had been their greatest protection for the entire journey up the channel. By morning, the Spanish crescent was gone. Ships were scattered across the coastal waters, and several had run aground on the sandbanks off the Flemish coast. The Battle of Gravelines the next morning was the true turning point. With the Spanish formation destroyed and individual ships isolated and disorganized, English vessels moved in at closer range and hammered them for 8 hours. Several Spanish ships were sunk or driven aground, many more were badly damaged, and crucially, the Spanish were running dangerously low on ammunition. They had packed their guns for a different kind of battle and had not brought enough cannonballs for a sustained long-range gun duel. When the shooting finally stopped, the English fleet was still largely intact. The Armada was broken. But there was still no question of surrender, and Medina Sidonia, to his credit, showed real composure in a desperate situation. He couldn't go back the way he came. The English fleet sat between him and the Channel. He couldn't land in the Netherlands. Parma's army was still blockaded in port. There was only one option remaining. The Armada would sail north, around the top of Scotland, and then south around the western coast of Ireland, back to Spain. It was a journey of over 2,000 miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the world, and August in the North Atlantic is not forgiving. The storms that came were catastrophic. Ships that had already been damaged in battle were now fighting mountainous seas and howling winds. Navigation off the coast of Ireland, without accurate charts, without GPS, without any margin for error, was a nightmare. One by one, ships were driven onto the rocks. Some crews made it to shore, only to be killed by English forces or by local Irish clans acting on orders from the English crown. A few survivors were sheltered and protected by Irish families in quiet acts of mercy that get lost in the larger story but deserve to be remembered. When the survivors finally staggered back into Spanish ports in the autumn of 1888, the scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Of the 130 ships that had sailed with such ceremony and confidence from Lisbon in May of 1588, around 67 made it home. Roughly 20,000 men were dead, most of them not from cannon fire, but from drowning, starvation, disease, and the cold. Medina Sidonia arrived back in Spain gaunt, ill, and devastated. He asked Philip to be relieved of all his duties. Philip refused. The work had to continue. Philip II, to the surprise of many, did not collapse. He read the reports from his admirals, attended Mass, and began rebuilding. Spain was rich enough to absorb the loss materially, and Philip interpreted the disaster not as a sign that his cause was wrong, but as a sign that God was testing him. He would launch 2 more armadas, in 1596 and 1597, and both would be destroyed by storms before they even reached England. By the time Philip died in 1598, England remained Protestant, independent, and deeply proud of what it had survived. The English celebrated the victory as something almost miraculous, and in a way they were right to. Elizabeth ordered a commemorative medal struck with a Latin inscription that translates roughly as, "God blew and they were scattered." The storm winds that finished off so many Spanish ships were framed as divine intervention, as though the very elements had chosen sides. The English didn't just win a battle, they built a national identity around it. And yet, the story of the Armada is not really a story about English greatness or Spanish failure. It's something more complicated and more interesting than that. It's a story about the gap between ambition and execution, about what happens when the mightiest power in the world mistakes confidence for capability. Philip II had the resources, the manpower, the motivation, and the blessing of an entire church. What he didn't have was a plan that could actually work, commanders who were chosen for their talent rather than their titles, and a realistic understanding of what his enemy was capable of. The Armada failed not because of any single mistake or any single storm. It failed because it was built on assumptions that England was weaker than it was, that Drake was a pirate and not a strategist, that Parma's army could simply step onto barges and cross the sea as if water were just a road. It failed because the people at the top of the hierarchy believed that power was self-fulfilling, that if you gathered enough ships and soldiers and said enough prayers, history would simply arrange itself in your favor. It didn't. History almost never does. And that, perhaps, is what makes this story resonate across the centuries. The Armada was one of the earliest and most spectacular examples of the truth that every empire, every army, every overconfident institution eventually has to face. That the largest fleet in the world is still only as strong as the plan it carries, the leaders it trusts, and the humility it lacks. The ships themselves were magnificent, the vision was grand, but somewhere between the harbor in Lisbon and the rocks off the Irish coast, the gap between what Spain believed it could do and what it was actually prepared to do became a graveyard. The English Channel still runs cold and gray between those two countries. The names of the ships are still recorded in Spanish archives: the San Martín, the San Salvador, and the Nuestra Señora del Rosario. And at the bottom of the ocean off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, some of those ships still rest, slowly dissolving in the dark water, carrying with them the armor and the cannons and the prayers of 30,000 men who had set sail at the peak of the most powerful empire on earth, absolutely certain they could not lose.